Hello and welcome to another episode of Mana Reads. This is Mana. So, in the last episode, we read the prologue where we found out that the crown prince fell from grace, um, not just once but three times. That's actually kind of impressive. And so now we're going to read chapter 1, The Scrap Immortal, third time entering the heavenly capital. And we're going to see how the Crown Prince fares this time. Heaven's Official Blessing, Chapter 1, The Scrap Immortal's third time entering the heavenly capital. Congratulations, Your Highness! Hearing this, Zilan looked up and smiled before anything else. Thank you, but can I ask what you're thanking me for? What you're congratulating me for? Lin Wen Zeyun stood tall with her hands folded behind her back. Congratulations! You have won first place on the chart of heavenly official most hoped to be banished down to the mortal realm of this calendar cycle. Well, no matter what, first place is first place, Zilan said. But since you're congratulating me, is there anything that's actually worth being happy about? Yes, Ling Wen replied. First place on this chart receives 100 merits. Zilan immediately said, if there are any similar charts in this future, please absolutely call me up. Do you know who second place is? Lin Wen said. Zilan pondered for a moment, then replied, that's too hard to guess after all. In terms of ability, I should be able to take the first 3 places myself. Pretty much, Lin Wen said. There isn't a second place. You're so far ahead that you've left everyone in the dust. That's too great of an honor, Zilan replied. Then who was first place the previous calendar cycle? There was no previous winner, Lin Wen said, because this chart was first established today. Huh, Zinlin was taken aback. You don't mean to say that this chart was set up just for me? Lin Wen replied. You can think of it as you just so happened to make it in time and just so happened to steal first place. Zinlan grinned, his eyes squinting into creases. All right, I'll be happier if I think of it that way. Do you know who got first place? Lin Wen continued. By popular demand, Lin Wen guessed. Let me explain the reason to you, Lin Wen said. Please look at that bell. Zinlan turned his head to gaze toward where she pointed, and what he saw was an extremely beautiful sight. There was a grand palace temple made of white jade, abundant towers, pavilions, and gazebos, with heavenly clouds lingering as streams flowed and birds danced. He took a good look for a while, then asked, Did you perhaps point in the wrong direction? There's no bell anywhere. I didn't, Lin Wen said. It's right there, don't you see it? Zinlin looked again seriously, then answered honestly, I don't. Lin Wen replied, It's all right if you don't. There used to be a bell there, but when you ascended, it fell because of the tremors. That bell is older than you, but it had a spirited character and enjoys a good spectacle. Whenever someone ascends, it tolls a few times in applause. When you ascended, the tremors were so strong that the bell tolled like mad and couldn't stop at all. In the end, it shook itself off the bell tower before it finally ceased, and when it did, it crashed down onto one of the heavenly officials passing by. Is everything better now? Zinlin inquired. Not yet. It's still under repairs, Lin Wen replied. I meant that heavenly official who was hurt, Zinlin clarified. No one was hit. It was a martial god, Lin Wen said. A flick of his hand and the bell was chopped in two, right then and there. Now, please look over at that golden palace. Do you see it? Again, Zinlin looked to where she was pointing and saw amidst the haze and clouds the resplendent gold-glazed roof. Ah, this time I see it. It's not right if you see it, Lin Wen said. There wasn't anything there before. When you ascended, the golden pillars of the golden palaces of a number of heavenly officials collapsed from the tremors, and their glazed roof tiles shattered. There are some that won't be so easily fixed, so the heavenly officials could only put together some last-minute palaces to make do for the time being. Am I the one responsible? You're the one responsible. Xinlan asked to confirm. So I've offended many officials since the moment I arrived. If you can make amends, maybe not, Linwen said. How do I make amends? Easy. With 8,880,000 merits. Xinlan grinned again. Linwen added, Of course I know you don't have even a tenth of that amount. Xinlan replied earnestly, How do I say this? Even though I'm very sorry, if you want just 10,000th of that amount, I don't have it. The faith of mortal believers was converted into a spiritual power of a heavenly official. Every stick of incense they lit and every offering they gave were thus called merits. Xinlan turned solemn in the place of a smile and asked seriously, Are you willing to kick me down from here and give me 8,880,000 merits for it? I'm a civil god, Linwen said. If you're looking for someone to kick you down under, you'll need to find a martial god to do it. The harder they kick, the more merits they'll give. Xinlan heaved a long sigh. Please allow me to think about what I should do. Linwen patted his shoulder. Don't worry, there will always be a path when the carriage reaches the mountain. Boats always sink when they reach the pierhead for me, though, Xinlan said. If this were 800 years ago, when the Palace of Zanli was at its peak of prominence, 8,880,000 merits would be nothing. The Crown Prince could throw it out without batting an eye. But present wasn't the same as the past, and all his temples in the mortal realm had long since burned to the ground. He had no believers, no incense, and no offerings. There was no need to say more on the subject. Either way, he had nothing. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He crouched by himself on the side of the main street of the heavenly capital, feeling distraught for a while, before suddenly remembering he'd ascended for almost 3 days now, but he still hadn't entered the communication array of the upper court. He'd forgotten to ask what the verbal password was. The heavenly officials of the upper court had gotten together and set up an array that could instantaneously allow the consciousness to communicate and pass on messages. Once ascended, one must enter the array, but a password was required for the consciousness to find the designated channel. The last time Xinlan had entered the array was 800 years ago, so he didn't remember the password at all. He had let his consciousness scatter to search and saw a channel that seemed to be what he was looking for. So he went in randomly. The moment he entered, he was blasted by an outpouring of crazed yelling from all directions. Place your bets and no take-backs. Let's wager on how long our Royal Highness the Crown Prince can last before going down again. I'll bet 1 year. 1 year is too long. Last time he was only 1 incense time. It'll be 3 days this time, I think. I'll put my merits down on 3 days. 3 days. Don't, you dimwit. 3 days is almost over already. Do you even know how to gamble? Xinlan silently exited the array. He entered the wrong one. That couldn't be it. The heavenly officials of the upper court of heaven were all bigwigs who guarded over a given region. They were widely known by every household and kept occupied by a myriad of state affairs. Since they were deities who ascended respectively, in keeping with their status, they were generally more reserved and often put on airs. Xinlan himself had been the only one who had dragged out every single heavenly official inside the communication array to greet them out of excitement the first time he ascended, incomparably earnest and exceedingly thorough in introducing himself from head to toe. After he exited the array, he went on another random search and entered a different one. This time he relaxed, thinking to himself, how quiet. This is probably one. Just then he heard a voice say softly, So, your Highness is back. It was a very comfortable voice. The sound soft and gentle, the tone decorous. However, if one were to listen closely, one would discover that the voice was quite cool and indifferent, the same as the sentiment it carried, causing that soft gentleness to turn into something more malicious in intent. Xinlan had intended to enter the array in a proper manner, then lie low, but since the other party had already addressed him, he couldn't keep pretending to be deaf and mute. Besides, he was still delighted that there were actually heavenly officials in the upper court who would willingly start a conversation with a god of misfortune like himself. Thus he quickly answered, "Yeah, hello everyone, I'm back again." Yet little did he know, after this exchange, every single heavenly official who was currently inside the communication array perked up their ears. That heavenly official said languidly, "Your Highness certainly ascended with tremendous force this time, huh?" Within the upper court of heaven, emperors, kings, generals, and chancellors were everywhere, and heroes flowed like water. In order to become a deity, one must first achieve greatness within the mortal realm. Those who had obtained accolades or ones in possession of great talent had always had a better chance at ascension. So it wasn't an exaggeration to say that rulers, princesses, princes, and generals weren't a rarity here. Everyone was a darling of the heavens. Everyone acted courteously with each other. So they would address one another as Your Majesty, Your Highness, Lord General, Alliance Chief, Head Chief, whatever, as long as the title was flattering. However, the words from this one heavenly official seemed to have something lurking beneath their tone. Although he said, "Your Highness this, Your Highness that," Zilan couldn't sense a bit of respect from him at all. It was more like he was poking him with a needle. There were also several heavenly officials inside the communication array, who were authentic crown princes, and they were feeling the hairs on the back of their necks rise from such an address. Incredibly uncomfortable, Zilan could tell that this other party didn't come with good intentions, but he didn't want to fight, so he chose to run instead. He smiled. It wasn't so bad. However, that heavenly official wouldn't give him a chance to run. He said tepidly, "It's Your Highness after all. So it wasn't too bad for you. But my luck doesn't seem to be as good." Suddenly Zilan had heard a private message from Linwen. She only said one word, "Bell." Instantly Zilan understood. So this was the mortal god who was hit by the bell. If that was the case, then the other party wasn't angry without reason. Zilan had always been adept at apologizing, so he immediately said, "I heard about the accident with the bell, and I'm dreadfully sorry. I do apologize." The other party humphed, the meaning unclear. There were a great number of renowned martial gods in the heavenly realm. Many of them were newly ascended dignitaries who came after Zilan's time. Zilan couldn't be sure who this person was by voice alone. He couldn't stay ignorant of his name after apologizing either, so Zilan inquired, "Might I ask how I may address my lord?" The other fell silent at this time. Not only did the other fall silent, it was like the entire communication array froze, and the air was assaulted with stagnation. From the other end, Linwen sent him another message. "Your Highness, although I think you should have recognized him after talking for so long, I still want to give you a hint. That's Lanwen." "Zanlin?" Zilan said. He was stumped for a moment before he finally came around, then sent a voice message back in shock. "That's Muying?" General Zalan was the martial god of the southeast, who possessed 7,000 temples. His name in the human world was considerably distinguished, and this General Lanzin's real name was Muying. 800 years ago, he was a deputy general at the Zanli Palace of the Crown Prince. Lin Wen was also quite shocked. "You really didn't recognize him?" "I really didn't," Zilan replied. "He didn't talk to me like this back then. Besides, I can't even recall when we last met. It was either 5 or 6 centuries ago. I can barely remember what he looks like, so how could I possibly remember what his voice sounds like?" The communication array was still in deep silence. Mu Ying didn't utter a sound. The other heavenly officials were pretending they weren't listening, while waiting on the edge of their seats for whichever would continue the conversation. Things were rather awkward when it came to those two. The complicated plot had been spread in rumors for so many years that everyone basically knew the story at this point. Back then, when Zilan was still the esteemed Crown Prince of Zanli, he trained at the Royal Holy Temple. This Royal Holy Temple was a royal cultivation hall in the Kingdom of Zanli. which was a very strict standard for selecting disciples. Mu Ying came from the slums, and his father was an executed criminal. Someone like that didn't qualify for acceptance to the royal holy temple, so he could only run errands within the temple grounds. He was someone who cleaned the Royal Highness's room and served tea and water. Zealand saw how hard he was working, so he requested that the state persecutors make an exception and accept Mu Ying as a disciple. It was only by the golden mouth of his Royal Highness that Mu Ying could enter and to cultivate and be trained alongside the crown prince. Then, after ascension, Zealand appointed him his general and took him along to the heavenly capital. However, when the kingdom of Zanli fell and Zealand was banished to the mortal realm, Mu Ying didn't follow. Not only did he not follow, he never spoke a word in Zealand's favor. Either way, the crown prince was gone, so he was free. He found a cave on a piece of auspicious land and trained arduously. And not a few years later, he passed a heavenly tribulation and ascended to heaven himself. In the past, one was in the heavens and one on earth. Now, there was still one in the heavens and one on earth. It was simply that their positions had switched completely. That's all. On this end, Linwen said, "He's very upset." "I figured as much," Zinlan said. "I'll go start another topic of conversation. You'd best take chance to leave," Linwen suggested. "No, that's okay," Zinlan replied. "It's fine as long as you pretend nothing's happened." "Are you sure?" Linwen said. "I feel awkward just watching you two." "It's not that bad," Zinlan replied. For someone like Zinlan, everything besides death really was okay. He didn't have a lot and was certainly not shame. He had done much more awkward things, so he generally felt that this was okay. Yet who knew that okay wasn't a word to be uttered lightly? He had only just said, "It's okay," when a voice roared angrily, "Who the fuck knocked down my golden palace? Show yourself!" This angry roar was going to make the heads of all the gods explode, while they were already filled to the brim with surging complaints. Still, each of them held their breath. This angry roar was going to make the heads of all the gods explode, while they were already filled to the brim with surging complaints. Still, each of them held their breaths, waiting soundlessly to hear Zinlan was going to answer this accusatory cry. Yet unexpectedly, things only got more exciting. Before Zinlan had opened his mouth, Mu Ying spoke up first. Or rather, he only snorted. The newcomer spat coldly. "You knocked it down. Good. Just you wait." Mu Ying replied coolly. "I didn't say it was me. Don't make false accusations," the other said angrily. "Then what are you laughing about? Are you out of your mind?" "No reason. You just sound funny, that's all," Mu Ying said. "The one who knocked down your golden palace is in the communication array right now. Go interrogate him yourself." When things reaching this point, Zinlan was too embarrassed to run away just like that. He cleared his throat. "It was me. I'm sorry." The moment he spoke, the one who came after also fell silent. Next to his ear, Linwen messaged him again. "Your Highness, this is Nan Ying." "This one I know," Zinlan had said. "But it seems he doesn't recognize me." "He does," Linwen confirmed. "It's just that he spends most of his time roaming the mortal realm and barely comes back to the heavenly capital. He didn't know you had ascended again, that's all." Nan Yan Zhen Yun was the martial god of the southeast. He possessed 8,000 temples and was incredibly loved by the people. His real name was Fu Yin, and 800 years ago he was a member of number 1 heavenly general of Zanli Palace of the Crown Prince. Benzing was loyal to a fault. He had been Zinlan's imperial bodyguard since the Crown Prince was 14 years old. He grew up with Zinlan. They entered the heavens together, were banished together, and drifted together. Unfortunately, they couldn't endure all 800 years together. In the end, it was an unhappy separation, as each went their own way, never to meet again. The master of foregone days, fallen so low as to be the laughingstock of the 3 realms, with neither offerings, temples, nor believers. All the while, the 2 servants under him had both passed a heavenly tribulation and became great martial gods themselves who guarded their own domains. Under these circumstances, it was impossible for anyone not to think too much. If Zinlan had to choose between Fenyin and Muying, and to say who made him feel more awkward, he would answer, "They're both fine." But if bystanders had to choose whether they wanted to see Zinlan brawl with Fenyin or Muying, that would depend on the individual's taste. After all three had significant reasons to beat each other up, so it would be a hard pick. Which was why everyone was severely disappointed when Fenyin did not respond for the longest time. He didn't say a single word, and instead went invisible. And so Zinlan concluded the scene on his own, beating himself up voluntarily. I didn't think things would get this out of hand. It wasn't intentional, and I do apologize to everyone for having caused trouble. Mu Ying replied sarcastically. Oh, what a coincidence. Coincidence. Zinlan also thought this was quite a coincidence. How did he so coincidentally hit Mu Ying and wreck Kuei-Yin's palace? From many bystanders' perspective, this was practically intentional revenge. But the truth was thus. He was just the type who could pick up a single poisoned cup in 1,000 cups of wine. It wasn't like he could do anything about what the others thought, so Zinlan could only reply, I will do my utmost to compensate everyone for their golden palaces and other damages. I pray you will all give me a little time. It didn't take any brains to see how obvious it was that Mu Ying wanted to keep making snide remarks. But his golden palace didn't suffer any damage. The bell that fell on him was also chopped in two. If he continued to be so overbearing, it would be unseemly for someone of his status. Thus, he also fell silent and went invisible. Then Zinlan saw that the awful messes themselves were now gone, and he quickly fled too. He was still pondering deeply and seriously on where he could go to get his hands on 8,880,000 merits. The next day, Lin Wen invited him to the palace of Lin Wen. Lin Wen was a heavenly official who managed the affairs of celestial personnel and controlled the smooth sailing and rapid career promotion of humans. The entire palace was stacked full of official documents and scrolls from the ground to the ceiling. Quite an astounding sight, enough to make one quake with fear. On the way over, every heavenly official who emerged from the palace of Lin Wen was holding stacks of documents that were taller than the average person. Their complexions were ghastly pale, looking either like they were breaking down or numb. After Zinlan entered the Great Hall, Lin Wen turned around and got straight to the point. Your Highness, the Heavenly Emperor has a request for you. Will you give him some assistance? There was plenty of Zhen Yun and Wan Yun in the heavenly realm, but there was only one who could be addressed as the Emperor. If this lord wanted something done, he needed to ask first, which is why Zinlan was a little taken aback before he replied. What is it? Lin Wen handed him a scroll. Recently, there have been a large number of grand believers from the north making frequent prayers, so I imagine things must not be peaceful there. The name Grand Believer usually referred to one of three types of people. The first type were rich, those who paid for incense and religious services and built temples. The second type were missionaries, people who promoted their religion and gave sermons. The third type were believers who possessed absolute faith in both heart and body. Among the three, the first type dominated. The richer someone was, the more they feared and respected the gods and ghosts, and there were many as rich people as there were fish in the sea. The third type was the least common, because if someone could genuinely reach that level, then their spiritual state must be exceptional, and they wouldn't be far from ascension themselves. The ones spoke of here were obviously the first type. The Heavenly Emperor cannot attend the north right now, Lin Wen explained. If you are willing to make the trip over on his behalf, then in the future, regardless of how many offerings these grand believers give as a gesture to pay off their vows, everything will be counted under your altar. What do you think? Zinlan received the scroll with both hands and said, Thank you. It was clearly Zhen Yu helping him, but the Heavenly Emperor made it sound like he was asking Zinlan for help. Of course Zinlan could tell, but he couldn't find the right words to express how he felt besides those two. Lin Wen replied, I'm only responsible for getting things done. If you wish to say thanks, wait until the Heavenly Emperor returns, and go thank him directly yourself. Do you need me to lend you any spiritual devices? No, Zinlan said. Even if you gave me a spiritual device, I wouldn't have any spiritual power once I go down there. I couldn't use it anyway. Having vanished twice, Zinlan had lost all his spiritual powers. Things were fine in the heavenly realm. The heavenly realm was a place where divine palaces stood and spiritual chi was abundant, endless and right at his fingertips for him to use. However, once back in the mortal realm, he was stunted. If he wanted to have a spiritual battle with anyone, he'd have to borrow said power from someone to make it. Quite the inconvenience. Lin Wen pondered for a moment. Then it's the best if we call a few martial officials over to lend you a hand. The martial gods that were currently in office either didn't know him or loathed him. Zinlan knew that much at least. Forget about that too. No one will come. Lin Wen had her own considerations, however. I'll give it a try. It wouldn't matter whether she tried or not, Zinlan neither agreed nor protested and let her go off to try on her own. Thus Lin Wen entered the communication array and clearly and loudly asked, "Everyone, the Heavenly Emperor has an urgent matter in the north and is in dire need of capable hands. Is there any martial highness who can assign 2 martial officials from their palace?" Just as the words were spoken, Mu Ying's voice popped up airily. "I hear the Heavenly Emperor is not in the north at the moment, so this is probably a call for assistance from His Highness the Crown Prince, am I right?" Zinlan thought to himself, are you just lurking inside the communication array at all times of the day? Lin Wen thought the exact same thing and deeply wanted to slap Wu Ying out of the array for obstructing her work. But still she smiled outwardly. "Wan Yin, how come I keep seeing you inside the array these days? Seems like you've got free time on your hands lately. Congratulations!" Wu Ying replied coolly. "My hand is wounded. I am currently nursing the injury." Every heavenly official thought to themselves, that hand of yours can chop the mountains and splash the seas without breaking a sweat. What could splitting a bell do to you? Lin Wen had wanted to wait until she tricked 2 people into volunteering before saying anything at first. Yet not only did Mu Ying figure it out easily, he had to say it out loud too. Now there surely won't be anyone available. As expected, not a single soul responded, but Zinlan didn't think much of anything of it. He turned to her. "I told you no one would come. If Wang Yin didn't say anything, I would have succeeded," Lin Wen said. Zinlan chuckled. "You worded it like a pipa player with half her face covered within the fog. The flowers look 3 times more beautiful. If others thought it would do work for the Emperor, of course they would have come. But if they came and discovered they're working with me, there would probably be a riot. And how could we cooperate under those conditions? Either way, I'm used to being alone. It's not like I lost any limbs during all these years. So we'll leave it as it is. Thank you for all the trouble. I'll be off now." Lin Wen was out of ideas too. She cupped her hands in salute. "All right. Wishing everything goes smoothly for your highness down below. May heaven's officials give their blessing. No paths are bounds," Zinlan replied, waved his hand and left in a dashing manner. 3 days later, the mortal realm in the north. There was a tea shop by the side of the major street. Its storefront wasn't big, a small operation, but what was good about it was the scenery. There were mountains and waters, people in the city. It had it all, but not much, just right. If one was to have a chance meeting here in the landscape, it would definitely become a beautiful memory. The tea master inside the shop was extremely idle. When there weren't any customers, he'd bring a stool out to sit by the entrance to watch the mountains and the waters. The people in the city, quite jolly as he looked on. Today he saw a white-clad cultivator who had come down from the road from a distance. The cultivator was travel-worn, as if he had walked for a long time. When the man came close, he brushed past the small shop at first, but suddenly he halted. Then very slowly he backed up. Lifting the tip of his bamboo hat, he looked up, glanced at the shop sign and smiled. Little Shop of Chance Encounters. What an interesting name. While this man appeared somewhat tired, his expression was a cheerful one, so much that the one watching him couldn't help but lift the corners of his lips too. The man then asked, "Excuse me, is Mount Yuzhen nearby?" The tea master pointed in a direction for him. "It is indeed around here." The man let out a sigh. He managed not to let his entire soul out while he was doing it. He thought to himself, "I finally made it." This was indeed Zinlan. When he left the heavenly capital that day, he had originally set the desired landing location in the mortal realm to be somewhere near Mount Yuzhen. Yet who knew, when he left in such a dashing manner, that he jumped down dashingly, that his sleeve would be caught by a dashing cloud. Yes, it was caught by a dashing cloud. He didn't know how his sleeve got caught, but either way, he tumbled across the million-meter-high sky, and by the time he tumbled down, he no longer knew where he was. After walking on foot for 3 days, he finally made it to the first intended landing point, and he sighed deeply with emotion. Zealand entered the shop and picked a table next to the window, ordering tea and snacks. After he finally settled, there was suddenly a sound of weeping and gongs being played outside. He gazed toward the main street and saw a group of men and women, both young and old, escorting a bright red Mercedes sedan as it passed by. The air surrounding this procession was downright odd. At first glance, it seemed like a marriage procession, but upon closer look, there was a solemnity, grief and fury, and terror on those faces. The only emotion missing was joy. It didn't look like they were festive at all. And yet, they still wore all red with flowers and made an ostentatious show. Since such a scene was truly it was exceedingly peculiar, the tea master raised the copper teapot in his hand and tipped it over to pour tea. He also saw this scene play out, but he only shook his head before moving on. Zinlin watched as the bizarre procession disappeared into the distance, and he grew deep in thought for a moment. Just as he was about to take out a scroll, the scroll Lin Wen had given him to read it over once more, he suddenly sensed something dazzling flit by. He then looked up. A silver butterfly flew past his eyes. That silver butterfly was glittering and translucent, and as it fluttered through the air, it left a sparkling bright trail in his wake. Zealand reached out toward in spite of himself. This silver butterfly was incredibly intelligent. Instead of being alarmed by a movement, it stopped at the tip of his finger. Its wings shimmered beautifully and serene, and beneath the sunlight, it felt like the illusion of a dream that would shatter at a single touch. A moment later, it flew away. Zinlin waved at it in farewell, and he turned his head back around. There were 2 more people sitting at his table. There were 4 sides to this table, and those 2 took a side, one left and one right. They were both young men of 18 or 19 years of age. The one on the left side was taller, with deep brows and handsome features. His eyes carried a sort of unbridled wildness. The one on his right was extremely fair, elegant, and poised. His expression was a bit overtly distant and cold, making him look as he was extremely displeased. Actually, neither of them looked pleasant. Zealand blinked. "You 2 are..." Here is the illustration in the book. It's very nice. The one on his left replied, "Nanfen." The one on his right said, "Fu Yao." "I wasn't asking for your name," Zealand thought. Just then, Lin Wen suddenly transmitted a message. "Your Highness, there are 2 junior martial office officials from the middle court who have volunteered to go assist you. They've already descended to find you and should be there now." This middle court was naturally the opposite of the upper court. The heavenly officials of the heavenly realm could be crassly divided into 2 groups, those who had ascended and those who hadn't. The upper court consisted of heavenly officials who ascended on their own abilities. There were only about 100 of them in the entire heavenly realm, extremely eminent. As for the ones in the middle court, they were brought up as appointed generals. Strictly speaking, they should be addressed as peer heavenly officials. But when everyone addressed each other, they'd often take out peer in the name. One might ask, if there was an upper court and a middle court, was there a lower court? No. Actually, there had been one once when Zinli first ascended. At the time, the division was still upper court and lower court. However, later, everyone discovered a problem. When one was introducing himself, it sounded really bad to say, "I'm from the lower court." With the word lower, it felt like one was lower compared to the others. It must be known that there was definitely geniuses and outstanding figures with impressive spiritual power among them, and what they were missing was only one heavenly tribulation before they became real heavenly officials, and who knew that they would arrive soon. Thus it was proposed that the one word be changed, and saying, "I'm from the middle court," sounded much better, even though they both meant the same thing. In any case, after it was changed, Zinlan couldn't get used to it for the longest time. Zinlan stared at these two junior martial officials, each apparently more upset than the other, not looking at all like they had come voluntarily. He couldn't help but ask, Linwen, they don't look like they're here to help me work. More like they're here for my good-for-nothing head. I hope they're not here because of your trickery. Unfortunately, what he said didn't seem to be transmitted, and he couldn't hear Linwen's voice by his ear anymore either. He figured it was because he'd been away from the heavenly capitals for too long, and his spiritual powers were depleted. Without any choice, Zinlan first flashed a smile at the two junior martial officials, then said, Nanfen and Fuyao, was it? Let me first thank you both for volunteering to come help. The two only nodded, giving quite the attitude. It seemed they must have come from the retainment of a distinguished martial gods. Zinlan told the tea master to bring 2 more cups. Then he raised his own teacup, scraped the tea leaves aside, and he asked casually, Which highnesses are the two of you from? The palace of Nanyang, replied Nanfen. The palace of Yuanyan, replied Fuyao. Well, this was certainly horrifying. Zinlan gulped down his mouthful of tea. Did your generals tell you to come? The two answered in unison. My general didn't know I was coming. Zinlan pondered for a moment before asking again. Then do you know who I am? If those two junior martial officials had come in blind because of Linwen's deception and helped him, then they would get scolded by their own generals upon their return. It wouldn't be worth it. You're His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, Nanfen said. You're the justice of the mortal realm, the center of the world, Fuyao said. Zinlan choked for a moment, then asked Nanfen, uncertain, Did he just roll his eyes? Yes, Nanfen replied. Tell him to beat it. It wasn't a secret that Nanyan and Zinlan didn't get along. When Zinlan first heard of this, he wasn't surprised in the least, because Fenyin and Muyin hadn't shared any great friendship in the past. What had kept things peaceful was that they were subordinates, so when the Crown Prince said, Don't fight, be good friends, everyone held back and didn't flip out. Back then, when they got really upset, they'd stab at each other with words at most. But with the way things are now, faking it was no longer necessary. This was also why the two heavenly officials, folks believers in the southeast and southwest, regarded each other with contempt. Throughout the years, the Palace of Nanyan and Palace of Wanyan had always seen each other as enemies. The two before him now were a classic example. Fuyao sneered. Lin Wen Zeyun said that all willing volunteers are welcome. So what grounds are you telling me to scram? The word willing, uttered using that expression of his, really wasn't persuasive. Zinlan said, Just let me confirm. You two really came as willing volunteers. If not, then please don't force yourselves. The two answered in unison, I'm willing. Looking at these two grim, dispirited faces, Zinlan thought inwardly, You guys actually mean I want to kill myself, right? Well, in any case, Zinlan continued, let's talk business first. I'm sure you both know what you're doing here in the north, right? So I'm not explaining from the top. Nope, they said in unison. Not having a choice, Zinlan took out the scroll. Then I guess I start from the beginning for you two. It was said that many years ago, on the foot of the mountain Yujin, there was a couple about to get married. This couple was deeply in love. That groom waited for the marriage procession to arrive, but he had waited a long time and there was still no sign of the bride. Anxious, the groom went to the bride's house, but his father and mother-in-law told him that the bride had long since set out. Both families reported this to the authorities, and they searched all over to no avail. If she was eaten by the beasts of the mountain, then at very least there'd be a leftover arm or leg. How could she just vanish into thin air? Thus, of course, there was the suspicion that the bride wasn't willing to marry. So she colluded with the marriage procession and ran off. Who knew that many years later, when another couple was to marry, the same nightmare replayed? Once again, the bride was gone. However, this time there was something left behind. On a small road, the search party found a foot that hadn't yet been fully eaten. And that concludes Chapter 1 of Heaven's Official Blessing. I hope you enjoyed that reading. And my thoughts on the chapter was, man, Zinlin has it rough in heaven. It's not easy for him, right? Because, he's two former generals that were, serving him in life, and now, are more powerful than him. And apparently there's a long, big beef that's been held over for at least 800 years. So we'll see how that goes for him. There was a couple of things that I didn't mention. Chi, or ki, however you pronounce it, it's basically, it's power. It's what a world can use to make magic. Spiritual devices could be, or usually, depending on the kind of god you are. Like for Zinlan, who's when it was really good at like fighting, so he would have like a sword or something along those lines. But everybody is different. Like every god is different, so their spiritual device would not match his, if we were to have one. The other thing is like when you make merit. So making merit is actually a pretty like modern, well, not modern concept, but people make merit when they go visit temples. They pray, hoping for like blessings and things like that. So in this world, when when a believer goes to pray at a temple, that god will receive that merit, and they'll then turn into spiritual power or chi. So those are the two kind of different, like the two definitions. Also, there was a footnote, at the, actually, let me go get it, because it's actually kind of important. Well, I think it's cool that they include footnotes, like for, like, if when you're reading and you don't know something, because there's a lot of, like, there's a lot of different idioms, from, proverbs from, like, ancient China that, like, people aren't familiar with, so it's really cool that they put in footnotes. So this footnote is, when the boat gets to the pierhead, it will go straight with the current. It's a proverb that means everything will be all right. So, Zinlan, being, the person that he is, generally believes that things are going to work out at some point. It may not be like today or may not be tomorrow, but at some point things are going to work out well for themselves. Well, anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, subscribe, and share my channel. There will be the link to the first video, my first one, here. So you can watch that. And hope you all have a good day. Bye!